All right, we're here today to do our podcast over the early events of the Civil War. This is video one of what'll turn into at least two, maybe three videos, depending on how quickly I can get through the material. And then the first thing I say is that this presentation just scratches the surface of the Civil War. The Civil War is a long and complex conflict that takes literally years to completely understand. So don't feel like this is it. This is just some of the major concepts. It's the end of the year, or time's winding down, so we don't get a full view of the entire Civil War. So this is just some of the major events, the major events over the course of the war that we're going to focus in on. So, of course, the Civil War is a war between people of the same country. All right, there have been many civil wars, but one of the worst ones happened in America. And it's really significant in that it's a war between people of two countries, but it's one of the few conflicts in world history where eventually the goal of the war and the purpose of the war becomes not only to unify the nation, which is typically the goal of almost every civil war, but to also free an entire people. So it's very unique in that way. It's maybe not the worst in terms of total casualties in world history, but it's certainly a unique war in itself. The American Civil War originally was fought to keep the South from leaving the Union. That's how it starts out, as a war just to preserve the nation. But like I said, eventually it becomes an issue of slavery, and then what we're going to do with slavery, and can we end this horrible institution of slavery. So we need to talk about the advantages for both sides. And first we'll talk about the advantages of the North. And first of all is their population. Their population is 22 million. All right. Now, when we look at the population of the South, we see that's 9 million, and you might say, well, that's not too far off. I mean, it's more than double, but not a huge discrepancy. But you have to keep in mind that there were 4 million slaves in the South. So in reality, that population, that white population in the South, is only 5 million. So when you compare 22 million people in the North to 5 million white people in the South, and only white people fought in the Civil War, they didn't use slaves in their armies, that population discrepancy becomes much larger. Now, the South would have slavery for use in their industry and in their war efforts, but not actually fighting. So that's going to be one of the big things. Another big issue for the North, not an issue, but an advantage, is their industry. Okay, their ability to create basically the instruments of war. They had 90% of the country's industry at the time. One of the facts that Ken Burns points out in his documentary is that the Confederacy as a whole produced 1/4 of all the goods produced in New York State alone. So the Confederacy couldn't even outproduce one of the Union states, let alone the entire Union. So when it comes to warfare, eventually the North is really going to gain an advantage because of their complex industrial economy that will fuel their war effort. And as the war goes on, the Union soldiers continue to get resupplied, and they have the newest and best technologies and innovations, and the South just can't keep up. So especially as the longer the war goes on, the more you're going to see that economic advantage really take hold and overcome the early advantages that the South had. Another advantage is the efficient and extensive railroad system that the North had. When we talked about our debate, we talked about this quite a bit, that the North had, more than double the railroad of the South. It was all the same gauge, which means the same distance between the two railroad ties, which means any train from the North could run on any of the northern railroads. And they were really able to transport troops, to transport supplies, to resupply their armies much faster in the North. Now, the further they went into the South, they came into some issues, because in the South there was a lot of different railroad gauges, and it wasn't all standardized, and it wasn't ran as well as the northern railroad. So the further they got into the South, the less the advantage of the railroad took hold. But especially in Virginia, when the fighting took place in Virginia, the North would have a serious advantage because they could quickly resupply that army and get them fresh troops almost immediately. And the last major advantage is the Navy. One thing to keep in mind is the Confederacy had to build up an entire country from scratch. Their government, their army, their navy, it was like us during the Revolutionary War. They had to basically create everything on their own. They do a good job of creating a fairly effective government. They do a great job of creating a very effective fighting force, their army, but they never quite catch on with their navy. They never really have any semblance of naval superiority during the entire war. So And the Union's basically going to have their way on the seas, blockading Confederate cities, and it took them a while, but they eventually gained control of the entire Mississippi. The South's advantage, the first one, and it's kind of hard to explain, but they just had a lot of excellent generals. I don't know if it's the Southern lifestyle that they tended to send more people to places like West Point, or I don't know why so many good generals came from the South, and in particular from Virginia, but they had them. They had Robert E. Lee, they had Stonewall Jackson, they had Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and Albert Sidney Johnson, and so many amazing generals that were so effective throughout the course of the war, and it really, really keeps them in the fighting for a long time. If the North and South had swapped generals, this war probably would have been over in a couple months. But these excellent generals in the South, they're able to prolong the war because they just win battle after battle after battle. Even though the North had all the major elements you would need to win a war, they couldn't because their generals were so inept in comparison to the Southern generals. Another major advantage is that defending is almost always easier than attacking, especially with the type of warfare. In the video we talked about the new technologies that were used in the Civil War, the technological advancements, the rifled musket that could shoot 500 yards and typically killed at the range of 200 to 300 yards. The new cannons, a lot of these new innovations made defending a lot easier than attacking. And what we see in a lot of battles is that Southern troops are stationary, standing, defending a position, and the Union are constantly attacking them. And that would take a toll on the Union soldiers, and that would give an advantage to the Southern soldiers. And they won a lot of battles simply because they were typically defending versus attacking. Also, you understand the territory, you understand the terrain, the psychological advantage to defending ground, defending your home versus attacking someone else's home. Then the last advantage is that they were closer to the supplies. So they may not have had the railroads, as efficient a railroad system to get supplies to their armies, but the majority of the war was fought in the Confederacy. So that means that they were much closer to their lines of supply and could be resupplied a lot better. That question there is rhetorical. Think about it. Whose advantages are better? Ask yourself that, but we won't discuss that right now. We got to move on. Let's get into strategy real quick. The Union strategy is going to be mostly offensive. They're going to be on the attack. It was their job to subdue this rebellion, their job to stop it. If they didn't attack, then the South would just simply exist. It's kind of like Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War. They had to attack to put down their rebellion. We need to attack the South to put down the rebellion. And they know that if they can stay aggressive and they can stay dedicated to the war effort, then eventually through a war of attrition or just simply wearing down the South, they will eventually win because of the population, because of the industrial advantages. If they can stay committed to the war effort, it's only a matter of time before they will almost certainly win. And they use this Anaconda plan put forward by General Winfield Scott, an older soldier. He wouldn't play much of a role in the war, but he did come up with a general plan at the beginning of the war, and it links economics to combat. So they're going to first try to put up a blockade and seize as many ports as possible and stop the cotton trade to slow down the South's economy even more and prevent them from getting the money necessary to fuel their economy and to fuel their war effort. And then control the Mississippi River, once again controlling trade, and effectively, if you look at the map, basically cutting the Confederacy in half and controlling that major waterway, which was a major source of supplies and trade in their country. The next thing is to take Richmond, and they know that Richmond is going to eventually become the capital of the Confederacy, and typically in warfare, if you can capture a country's capital, you're typically in pretty good shape. Doesn't mean you've won the war, but it certainly doesn't hurt. You put their government into exile, they're forced to move around. It's really demoralizing to lose your capital. And plus, Richmond was really the economic hub of the Confederacy along with Atlanta, Georgia. Those were two of the major cities that made the Confederacy tick. One of the big things in Richmond was that was their major ironworks. Something called the Tredegar Ironworks was in Richmond. And if they could seize that, that would really, really harm the Southern economy and slow them down. Confederate strategy is very similar. I always compare it to our strategy during the Revolutionary War. Okay, they're going to defend and delay and hope that the Union gives up. And that's basically what we did during the Revolutionary Wars. We survived, we lasted, we kept fighting, we didn't give up, we didn't surrender, and eventually the war wore out the British, mostly because they were fighting other wars at the time as well, and they'd already gotten out of an expensive war. We're kind of hoping to do the same thing to the north, or the Confederacy was hoping to do the same thing to the north, to drag that war out as long as possible. And they're also going to hope to get intervention from Europe, and in particular France and Great Britain. They're hoping that those two nations that really need their cotton and imported a lot of cotton from the south, they're hoping that those two nations will step in and stop the war. Similar to the way in which we were hoping that the French would support us during the Revolutionary War. Of course, eventually they did, and that's one of the major reasons that we won the Revolutionary War. So the South is kind of copying the theory from the Revolutionary War, in that they want the war to last, they want to survive as long as they can, make the North weary of the war, hope that they start to believe that it's not worth fighting, and eventually hope to get intervention from Europe. They also from time to time want to threaten Washington and keep the war away from Richmond, keep the war as far north as possible. Not necessarily invade all that often, but they don't want it fought near Richmond. They don't want Richmond to be threatened the entire time. They'd rather threaten Washington, if anything. Because if you look on a map, the border of Virginia, actually Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, part of it is in Virginia. So the closer they can keep it to Washington, the more advantageous they feel like it is for them. And then they're going to seek a decisive victory, hopefully in the north. They're not going to attack very often, but when they do, they want to bring the warfare to the Union and let them see the dead bodies and let them see the horrors of war, and they would hope that that would turn the people against the war. Also, similar concept, threatening Washington, because Lincoln knows and the North knew that they lost Washington, D.C., that'd be a major loss, similar to how I said that seizing Richmond was a major goal of the North. For the South, if they were to somehow seize Washington, D.C., that'd be a major victory for them. So they're not going to attack the North very often, but they're going to kind of take their shots here and there. And if they can win a big victory in the North, that would certainly go a long way towards them gaining their independence. So once again, rhetorical question at the bottom, which strategy seems to be the most likely to succeed? Honestly, both of them were really optimal strategies for each side. Obviously, the Union is going to have certain advantages that are hard for the South to overcome. But given that, the South really comes up with a really unique and really the perfect strategy for what they're trying to do. And they almost get away with it. They almost succeed in winning the Civil War using their strategy. So they had major disadvantages that they had to overcome. But at the end of the day, they picked a really effective strategy. So when we come back, we will start talking about some of the battles, some of the early results in the war, and how early on it looks very bleak for the Union. And then we'll end the discussion with basically Grant coming in and really kind of saving the day for the North. So we will, because of how long this took, we will have 2 more videos after this that will complete your notes over the Civil War. Thanks. Sorry, one more thing, just thought of this. If you have any question about this lecture, or any question about readings or anything we've done in class, make sure to post them on my big campus. We're short on class time. We're getting towards the end of the year. We got a big final coming up. There's a lot of questions over the Civil War on the final. If you have questions, let me know, but contact me either in class or on my big campus. Ask a question, communicate, let me know. All right, thanks guys. Good luck.